we'll move promptly straight into the first session, in which Professor Dan Martin will join us from California over a Skype link to talk about compassion development.
Hello.
Hello, Dan.
Hi, how are you guys?
Yeah, okay. You're on live now to an audience of probably about 90 people. Very much welcome your ability and willingness to talk to us this morning. And I'll hand straight over to you. Everybody's got a copy of your CV and the topic of your talk. Over to you.
Well, hello everyone. I hope you're doing well. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So, going to let you know, number one, I speak with a strange accent, so I apologize about that. And along with the strange accent, I speak really fast. So, let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and we'll go ahead and dive right in. I know you have a lot of interesting things to do today. So, you let me know when you can see my screen. It should be coming up.
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay. So, again, a pleasure to be chatting with you guys this morning for you. We're going to be talking about compassion development, and I'm kind of a weird guy, but I hope you'll find this interesting. Let's dive into it. Obviously, before we talk about anything, it's pretty wise to define compassion from our perspective. And the first component really is going to be awareness, noticing of another's suffering. The second component is going to be the emotional or affective side of compassion, empathically feeling another person's pain. And the third part, which is really, for me, the most important part, is taking action to ameliorate the suffering of an individual. So, there's lots of work being done in compassion these days. Today, I'll talk a little bit about some specific work that we've done, but before we do that, I wanted to give you an example of compassion in action. You see this little kid over here? That's my daughter, and one day she wasn't feeling very well, and her grandma saw this and immediately rushed over to her and tried to make her feel better. When that didn't work out, she decided to give her some tender, loving care. So these are actual behaviors. It's noticing the person's suffering, feeling empathic about it, and then taking action. But what happens when grandma doesn't suffice? Yeah, that's right. You have to take out the big guns and go straight to grandpa. So grandpa came over and tried to make her feel better, but of course, in the end, it was nothing that a good bubbly drink couldn't fix with a hug. So this is compassion in action. It's a movement towards suffering. It's not just being nice. So we know that compassion is really strongly related to immune system functioning, physical and psychological well-being, but we see that this is not really talked about to the extent we'd like it to be at home in society as well as in the workplace. So when we think about this, it's probably wise to start looking at why there might be some blocks to compassion in the aforementioned places. I do a lot of work in some strange areas. My area of expertise, or one of my areas of expertise, is actually the impact of sexism and racism on high-stakes testing. So in that dimension, as a business professor, I'm oftentimes looking at people's preference for maintaining hierarchy in society. I'm using usually a theory called social dominance theory, and the individual measurement of this is social dominance orientation. And the kind of frightening thing about this is that people who tend to score high on this also score high in things like sexism, racism, and the likelihood of voting for Donald Trump. Sorry about that, easy Jeff. Whatever the case may be, we also find that these folks tend to be interested in the maintenance of hierarchy in specific disciplines. So these are the folks who study economics. These are the folks who study finance and a host of kind of hierarchically oriented occupations and disciplines. Once they're finished with school, of course, they tend to move towards organizations that really take this hierarchy-enhancing perspective. So for me, I wanted to really understand the relationship between social dominance orientation and compassion. So I went ahead, and this is one piece of research that I've been doing for some time. I started to look at the relationship between social dominance orientation and found that, of course, as you would expect, it's strongly related and significantly related to low levels of compassion for others. It's related to increased levels of fears of compassion, receiving this from others, giving it to others, as well as giving it to oneself. There's no real surprise there. We'll dive into that a little bit deeper. But interestingly, we found that this relates to higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. Now, as a business faculty member, I can tell you one of the highest causes of workers' compensation claims in the United States is actually stress. And we're not talking about the stress that you find on the workplace of lifting, bricks. We're talking about the psychological stress that makes folks really break down and leads to absenteeism, turnover, and real low levels of productivity. As a social psychologist, I can tell you that these have significant consequences in terms of people's relationships, be they at work or otherwise. Interestingly enough, when we looked at the mediating impact of adherence to free market ideology, we found that these relationships were partially mediated. This means that really adherence to free market ideology exacerbates the relationships between social dominance orientation and fears of compassion and stress, anxiety, and depression. This should give us pause because we are shoring up this kind of impact by virtue of our ideology. And we can talk about that some other time. There's a lot to chat about today. So, one of the folks that's done a great deal of work in this area is named Sir Paul Gilbert. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about Paul over the course of the day. Paul has put together a brilliant way of summarizing emotional regulation in the human system and suggests that there's 3 specific systems that we generally work within, and I'll talk about these. The first is the threat system, and we might see this as being the fight or flight system. The second system is our drive or ambition system, and sadly, in the workplace of Western societies, we tend to see people spinning between these 2 systems, the threat and the drive system. They really are ambitious, they want to do well, they want to get that next promotion, but oftentimes they're terrified that they won't and how others will judge them or how they'll judge themselves if they don't. The one system that Paul or Dr. Gilbert or Sir Gilbert brings to bear that we usually aren't talking about is the soothing system. And this is a place that needs as much attention as the 2 aforementioned systems. So what do we know about drive and threat in society? Well, it seems that those with strong threat and drive systems are constantly needing to prove themselves, they need to constantly achieve, and the drive system seems to be related to those things that maybe we could say are related to free market ideology, potentially status seeking, being competitive, as well as working to avoid rejection. Now, Paul, that's Paul right over there, has done some amazing work, and I'll just ask you a quick question. Have you ever been fearful of being compassionate? Yes. And that's a question for you out there in the radio audience. Well, whatever it is, I trust that in certain circumstances, maybe we've been fearful of being compassionate. Oftentimes we're scared of being compassionate to others because they might take advantage of us. Oftentimes we're afraid of receiving it from others. Number one, because we might be fearful that they might manipulate us, but if you're also male members of our species, you might feel like you could be being perceived as being weak. Importantly, when we think about ourselves and being compassionate to ourselves, oftentimes we're really scared of being overindulgent. So the fears of compassion scale that Gilbert put out has been a very handy tool because it's not enough just to tell people to be compassionate. We have to help them understand where it may be very difficult to be compassionate for these very reasons. So, I'm moving at a nice clip here. I just wanted to show you a small subsection of data coming from a paper that came out earlier in 2014, but it has everything to do with the fears of compassion, Dr. Gilbert Scales, and their relationship with stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, for those of you who are behavioral scientists, you realize that significant correlations are special things, but importantly, when they're really strong, it gives you pause. This is a subset of analysis that I did based on maybe about 400 students coming from both working Masters of Business Administration graduate programs as well as undergraduates in business. And what you see here is this real strong relationship between fears of compassion for others, giving it to others, and stress, anxiety, and depression is first line. The second line is a little bit more frightening, though, because this is fears of receiving compassion from others, and you can see the correlation spike, especially with depression. The thing that you need most when you might be depressed is to have the opportunity to receive some feedback, to be mirrored, and get some support from one of your friends, from your colleagues, from your family. So we can see that people are fearful of it. Similarly, we see compassion for self strongly related to, or I should say fears of compassion for self being strongly related to stress, anxiety, and again, a real strong correlation there with depression. So it would be remiss for me not to tie this into business because I do work in this area, and I think it's really critical for all of us to be thinking about ways that we can make compassion, mindfulness, and empathy accessible to the broader population. There are wonderful ways of ensuring that people have access to compassion through a myriad of spiritual and religious traditions. There are lots of different secular ways as well, but I think it behooves us to offer as many doorways to compassion as possible. So I'm oftentimes asking people to consider compassion, the 3-point definition I gave you previously, from a human resources perspective. And what I argue is that we use a lot of competencies for the purposes of pre-employment selection as well as performance appraisals that are quite behavioral and directly related to, again, our very behavioral definition of compassion, that being awareness of another's suffering, feeling empathy, and then taking action to ameliorate it. So when we think about competencies, we can see that things like conflict resolution, interpersonal skills, negotiation, customer service, leadership, and service orientation seem to be related to compassion, and I'll make the argument empirically just in a little bit that they do. And when we look at multidimensional constructs, tying them to organizational outcomes, we can see they relate to engagement, organizational citizenship behavior, and psychological capital. I'd also argue from a university perspective or from a healthcare organization perspective that these relate to the kinds of customer service, employee climate surveys, as well as client-based measures that are used in those environments as well, for the purposes of accreditation and other criteria. So a while back, I was interested in thinking, how can we best afford people an opportunity to engage in compassion development in an easy and scalable fashion, and was doing some large-scale mentoring at the time via the web, and came upon this concept of the Compassion Skills Training, or CST. Now, as a social psychologist, I did my best to create some good psychoeducational material and protocols to help people through this, but thankfully I'm really good friends with a wonderful young Israeli clinical psychologist named Yotam Heineberg, who did a fantastic and phenomenal job. We've been using it since. So let me walk you through this briefly. This is an 8-week web-based package that uses dyadic interactions to develop compassion in folks. People are matched psychometrically. It's hard to believe that you can meet your husband or your wife online using a matching system, but you can't meet participants in a dyad with positive outcomes. So I developed a psychometric tool to match people. But people then, once they've been matched, read small summations of scientific literature written for the layperson based on their week's specific topic, and then they chat with their colleagues using a protocol developed by Yotam. All of the sessions have pre and post measures associated with them based on the competencies that we're measuring. And the sessions actually have internal metrics in terms of how people are responding to the compassion development. Now, these outcomes are related to the clinical development of compassion, but could reflect whatever we're really trying to measure. So the great news is this does all the data collection for folks, and that gives people feedback on how they're doing based on norms. So what are we actually doing? Our topics move from week to week, and every week they learn about a concept, and they learn how to behaviorally manifest the concept, and then they give a little bit of a preview as to what they will be working on behaviorally over the course of the next week. The next week they actually share what they did the previous week, and then move on to the next topic. So what are the topics? The first one is helping them understand empathic and active listening. We do this in the framework of leadership for the business students, but of course do it for nursing in the nurses. We do it with psychologists, social workers, CEOs, a wide array of other occupations, so it has a veneer of whatever occupation we're using. The second session is all about mindful awareness and values clarification. But this time they're getting to know each other fairly well. The partnership is moving along and they're recognizing they have a lot in common. Then we move into the three-circle model that we were describing previously that comes from Paul Gilbert's compassion-focused therapy. From there, we move into Carol Dweck's work on mindsets and help them understand the difference of fixed and growth mindsets and how it might feel to move into that type of domain. From there, we finally get into compassion. We really want to give them the skill sets they need before they move towards suffering. So we talk about the first component of our three directions of care, which is receiving compassion. Then we move into applying self-compassion and spend some time on that because it's oftentimes a very foreign concept. From there, we go into developing and sharing compassion for others. And the last session is kind of a synthesis of all of the programs. Now, I should share with you what some of our results have been. We've had significant differences established in the following dimensions. We've been able to significantly increase compassion for others. We've been able to significantly increase subjective happiness, their leadership capacity. We've been able to significantly increase their acceptance and action. We've been able to increase their service orientation, as well as diminish significantly their fear of compassion for giving it to others. Interestingly enough, uniquely for men, we've been able to significantly increase self-compassion as well. We've been able to diminish their self-criticism and lower their fear of compassion in terms of receiving it from others. So this is really happy stuff for a bunch of different reasons. I want to share a few things really quickly. With our high social dominance orientation participants, we're actually able to significantly lower their levels of stress, anxiety, and depression as well. So this is good news for the business community. And a quick answer to our colleagues, these are students, 94% of them responded yes to, are you glad you participated in this program? This took them about an hour every week. We did this all online. And 94% answered yes to the question, would you recommend this to a friend? Now, stop and think about this for a second. When you were in the university, did you ever recommend homework to a friend? Not unless you hated them, right? So this is something that people really enjoy, and critically, it works effectively with good professors as well as professors who don't get very high ratings. I would take some time to share with you some of the participants' comments, but I'm happy to send this along after the presentation.
Dan, it's Mike. We're going to have to go for a wrap very shortly.
Okay.
If you could just sort of wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Absolutely. I'm going to pour through this really quickly. So, and thank you, Mike, very much. There we go, the conclusion. So, number one, again, let me thank you all very much. Really, what we wanted to show here is that you can have an empirically principle-driven approach to develop scalable applications, to develop compassion at the individual level, and then take the data, move it into community, business, organizational, as well as national levels. We do some work with mayors of American cities, and they're great measures of quality of life within cities. Importantly, we want to be able to give people positive evidence based on their interactions. We also want to give them tangible tools that they can use to get hired after they're finished with their college programs. I don't think anybody sitting in the audience or myself can say factually how much they shifted from the beginning of a class to the end of a class in any of the courses we've taken in any of our universities. So I think this is a real nice step in the right direction. We've got a couple different things going on right now. I'm going to Mexico on Saturday to implement this tool in terms of reducing student stress, anxiety, depression, increased compassion, etc., etc. That's happening at some universities down in Mexico. We're doing this in Sweden with a wide array of folks in business. And then finally, in the United States, we're doing this with healthcare providers and a variety of other institutions. Here's some resources for you. I work as a consulting scientist for CCARE over at Stanford, the Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research, and Education. Stop by. I'm the Director of Research for the Charter for Compassion. Don't hesitate to stop by there. Good resources as well. And then finally, here's Paul Gilbert's wonderful Compassionate Mind Foundation. Do stop by. You'll find out some of the great resources he has there. And then here's just a small picture of the people who have supported me most. That's Paul Gilbert right over there. That's Jim Doty, the neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, director of CCARE. And then Phil Zimbardo, of course, from the Stanford Prison Experiment. So I thank you guys so much. I know that was fast, but I really appreciate it and look forward to speaking with you in person next time.
Thank you, Dan, very much.